Robert is 63, and everyone at his office quietly feels sorry for him. He still shows up at 8:15 every morning, still parks in the same spot, still sits in the same corner desk he's had for 11 years, moving a little slower than he used to but never late. Half his coworkers assume Robert just loves his job too much to leave. The other half assume something went wrong, that he waited too long, saved too little, and now he's stuck. Here's the part that would actually surprise both groups. Robert isn't stuck. He's not even unhappy. He made a decision 3 years ago that most people never make on purpose, and it's the single reason his retirement is going to look completely different from almost everyone who clocked out at 65 without thinking twice about it. So let's talk honestly about working past 60, because the assumption almost everyone makes about it is exactly backwards, and by the end of this, you're going to know which side of that decision you're actually on. This isn't a video about hustle, and it isn't a video telling you to keep grinding forever. It's about the fact that still working past 60 hides two completely different stories inside one sentence, and almost nobody separates them before they judge themselves or anyone else by it. Here's what nobody tells you about turning 60. It's not one decision, it's about 5 decisions disguised as one birthday. Social Security, Medicare, your portfolio, your identity, and whether the work you're doing is something you chose or something you're trapped in. Most people only think about the first one, and that's exactly why the other 4 blindside them. Let's start with the number everyone assumes is a deadline. 65 feels like the finish line, the age you're supposed to stop. But the math behind Social Security tells a completely different story. If you claim benefits at 62, the earliest possible age, your monthly check gets permanently reduced, sometimes by close to 30% compared to waiting. Wait until 70, and it can grow by roughly 8% for every year you hold off past your full retirement age. That's not a rumor. That's a guaranteed increase, larger than almost any safe investment return you'll find anywhere else. And almost nobody explains it that plainly before the decision gets made. Here's why that gap matters so much. Most people picture Social Security like a light switch. You flip it on whenever you feel like it, and the amount is just whatever it happens to be. It isn't a light switch. It's closer to a dial you can quietly turn up every single year you wait, and the difference between flipping it early out of habit and turning that dial deliberately can be worth tens of thousands of dollars over a normal retirement. Nobody sits you down and shows you the dial. You just have to go looking for it. Meet Grace. Grace is 61. She retired at 60 because she'd always pictured retirement as this clean, defined line. You cross it, and the rest of your life is yours. For about 4 months, it felt exactly like that. Then the quiet set in. Not a money problem yet, a different kind of problem. She missed having somewhere to be. She missed being useful to someone besides herself. Nobody warned Grace that boredom could feel this much like grief. Grace did something worth mentioning here, though, because it's the honest, non-dramatic ending to her part of the story. 6 months in, she took a part-time role 2 days a week at a place she used to volunteer for. Nothing about her finances required it. What it gave back to her had nothing to do with money either. She just needed somewhere to be again, and she was honest enough with herself to go find it instead of pretending the quiet didn't bother her. Now meet Walter. Walter is 67, and Walter is still working, not because he has to, but because he wants to. He cut back to 3 days a week 2 years ago. He picked up a side project mentoring younger employees, something his old full-time job never left room for. Walter isn't clinging to a paycheck. He's using the extra years on purpose, and the difference between Walter and Robert is the exact thing we're going to unpack. Let's go back to Robert, because his story is the one most people are quietly living whether they admit it or not. Robert didn't choose to still be at that corner desk. 15 years ago, a divorce cut his retirement savings roughly in half. 10 years ago, he helped one of his kids through a rough financial stretch he never fully talked about at work. He kept meaning to catch up. Life kept happening instead. By 60, Robert did the math honestly for the first time in years, and the math told him something hard. If he stopped now, his savings might not outlast him. Here's what changed everything for Robert. And it's the piece almost nobody tells people your age about. After 50, the government actually lets you save more than everyone else, specifically because they know this exact situation happens all the time. It's called a catch-up contribution. On top of the normal limit, workers 50 and older can put thousands of extra dollars a year into a 401k or an IRA, tax-advantaged, specifically designed for people trying to close a gap late. Robert didn't know this existed until he was 61. The 3 years he's worked since then, maxing out that catch-up room, have done more for his retirement than the previous 10 years combined. Not because he suddenly earned more, but because those were his highest earning years landing on top of his largest allowed contributions. At the exact moment compounding had the least time left to punish a mistake and the most incentive to reward a good one. That's not a small detail. That's the entire reason working a few extra years past 60 can be worth more than working the same years at 40 ever were. There's a version of this that doesn't require staying full-time either, and it's worth knowing about even if it doesn't apply to you yet. Some employers allow what's usually called a phased retirement, cutting back to part-time hours while still holding on to benefits and still contributing, even in a smaller way, to retirement accounts. It's not available everywhere, and it's worth asking about directly rather than assuming it isn't on the table. Robert never asked. 2 years in, he found out by accident that his own company offered exactly that option and wished he'd known sooner. Here's the second piece nobody explains clearly. Social Security actually calculates your benefit off your highest 35 years of earnings. If you had a few thin years early in your career, raising kids, a layoff, a rough stretch, every extra year you work past 60 at a decent income can quietly replace one of those weak years in the calculation. Robert didn't just save more these last 3 years. He replaced 2 of his worst earning years from his 20s with 3 of his best. His benefit check went up because of arithmetic, not luck. Think about what that actually means for anyone who took time away from work at some point. A layoff, raising kids, caring for a parent, a career restart. Those thin years don't have to define your benefit forever. Every strong year worked past 60 has a real chance of quietly erasing one of them from the calculation, permanently, for the rest of your life. That's not a consolation prize. That's a genuine repair tool sitting in plain sight that almost nobody mentions out loud. Now here's the piece that has nothing to do with money at all, and it might matter more than any of it. There's a real, well-documented link between having a sense of purpose later in life and staying healthier longer. Not a vague feeling, an actual pattern researchers keep finding. People who feel needed, who have somewhere to be and something to contribute, tend to hold on to their health and their sharpness longer than people who don't. Grace felt that gap the moment the structure of her days disappeared. It wasn't the missing paycheck that hurt. It was the missing reason to get up. This is worth being honest about, because it cuts against the way most retirement advice gets sold. The advice almost always assumes the entire goal is to stop as fast as humanly possible, as if every extra year worked is automatically a year lost. For some people, genuinely, it is. For a lot of people, it's the opposite. The structure, the sense of contribution, the reason to get dressed in the morning, is doing something for them that a decade of vacation never could. Neither version is the responsible one, and neither is the lazy one. They're just different answers to the same honest question. This is exactly why Walter's story looks so different from Robert's, even though they're both still working past 60. Walter isn't propping up a shortfall. Walter found that the extra years, spent on his own terms, were quietly good for him, for his mind, for his sense of being needed, for the relationships he built mentoring people half his age. Robert's extra years are repair work. Walter's are a choice. Both of them are working past 60. Only one of them is doing it because he has to. Here's the honest question worth sitting with for a second. If the money disappeared entirely, if you had more than enough saved either way, would you still choose to work some version of what you're doing right now? Not the same job necessarily. Some version of being useful, being needed, having somewhere to be. If the answer is yes, you're closer to Walter than you think. If the answer is an immediate no, that's worth being honest with yourself about too, because it changes what your last working years should actually look like. There's one more piece almost nobody mentions, and it can quietly undo everything if you get the timing wrong. Medicare eligibility starts at 65, and missing your enrollment window, even by accident, even because you were still covered by a work plan, can trigger a permanent penalty added to your premium for the rest of your life. Not a one-time fee. Permanent. Robert almost missed his window because he assumed his employer coverage meant he didn't need to think about it yet. A single afternoon looking into the specific rules for his situation saved him from a mistake that would have quietly cost him every single month from 65 onward. And here's the psychological trap that catches people on both sides of this. The ones working by necessity and the ones working by choice. Comparison. Robert watches coworkers retire at 62 and feels behind, even though his 3 extra years are quietly repairing a gap that would have haunted him for 2 decades. Walter gets asked constantly why he's still working, as if it's something to apologize for, even though he built exactly the life he wanted. Neither of their situations is a race against anyone else's timeline. The only comparison that actually matters is your own number against your own future, and almost nobody else's clock has anything to do with yours. Robert's coworkers, the ones who quietly feel sorry for him, are comparing his calendar to their own without knowing a single number behind it. Walter gets the same silent judgment from people who assume anyone still working past 65 must need the money. Both assumptions are guesses dressed up as certainty, and both of them miss the only detail that actually matters. Not the age on the calendar, but the reason behind the hours. So here's the honest advice, and it's not the same advice for everyone reading their own situation into this. If you're working past 60 the way Robert is, because the math genuinely requires it, that's not a failure. That's you doing exactly the right thing at exactly the right time, using catch-up contributions and a few repaired years of earnings history to fix something that would have been far more painful to leave broken. Nobody should feel behind for doing the responsible thing 3 years later than they wish they had. If you're working past 60 the way Walter is, because it genuinely adds something to your life, that's not clinging to a paycheck. That's using years most people never think to use on purpose, and there's real evidence that purpose itself is part of what makes those years good ones. The only version of working past 60 actually worth questioning is the one Grace almost fell into without meaning to, assuming stopping is automatically the goal, without asking honestly whether stopping is actually what you want, or just what you assumed you were supposed to want. Go back to Robert at his corner desk at 8:15 in the morning. His coworkers still don't know which story they're looking at. Now you do. The extra years were never proof that something went wrong. They were proof that he was finally paying attention to something he'd put off for far too long. Here's the one line worth remembering. The goal was never to stop working by a certain age. The goal was always to reach a point where working became a choice instead of a requirement. And whichever side of that line you're on right now, there's still time to move toward it deliberately instead of by accident. Wherever you actually are in this, 3 years from 60, 3 years past it, or watching a parent live through exactly this decision right now, the same honest question applies. Is the work in front of you closing a gap, or is it something you'd choose even if the gap didn't exist? Neither answer makes you behind. Only not asking the question does. If this showed you something about your own next few years you hadn't thought through clearly, subscribe to Robin Wealth and hit the bell. We break down the hidden math behind the financial decisions you face every single day. Make the decision that matches your reality, not someone else's timeline.